Her stepmother introduced her to guests as the charity case we took in. She wasn't allowed to speak at the dinner table or use the family surname. 5 years of sleeping in the garage, 5 years of being erased. Then her billionaire grandfather, the one they said drowned, knocked on the door. The funeral took place on a gray afternoon when Ifeoma was 19 years old. She stood beside her father's casket in a black dress that no longer fit properly, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as the pastor spoke words that barely registered in her grief-clouded mind. Jabari Oluwaseun had been everything to her, protector, provider, the last connection to a mother she'd lost when she was only 7. Now he was gone too, taken by a car accident on a rain-slicked highway, and Ifeoma felt the ground disappearing beneath her feet. Her stepmother Nomvula stood beside her, one manicured hand resting on Ifeoma's shoulder in what looked like maternal comfort to the assembled mourners. On Nomvula's other side stood Busisiwe, Nomvula's biological daughter, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. The 3 of them looked like a grieving family unit to everyone watching, but Ifeoma could feel the coldness radiating from Nomvula's touch, could sense the impatience in that grip. Her father had married Nomvula 5 years earlier when Ifeoma was 12 and still raw from losing her mother. Nomvula had swept into their lives like a hurricane, elegant and commanding, transforming their home with her expensive taste and sharp tongue. Jabari had seemed happy, or at least less lonely, and Ifeoma had tried to accept this woman who could never replace her mother but who her father clearly loved. After the service, people gathered at their home, a beautiful estate, in an affluent neighborhood with perfectly manicured lawns and a circular driveway lined with luxury cars. Ifeoma moved through the crowd like a ghost, accepting condolences from people who'd known her since childhood, family friends who remembered when her mother was alive. Her grandfather Lungelo should have been there, but he'd died 3 years earlier, or so she'd been told. Nomvula had delivered the news with practiced sadness. Lungelo had drowned during a business trip to South Africa, his body swept away by ocean currents and never recovered. Ifeoma had been devastated, losing the grandfather who'd taught her to read, who'd told her stories about building his telecommunications empire from nothing, who'd promised she'd inherit his strength and determination. Now both her grandfather and her father were gone, and she was alone with Nomvula and Busisiwe. The lawyer arrived as the last guests were leaving, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who spread papers across the dining room table with efficient movements. Ifeoma sat numbly as he read her father's will, the legal language washing over her until certain phrases cut through her grief. Everything, the house, the investments, the substantial life insurance policy, was left in trust for Ifeoma, with Nomvula appointed as legal guardian and trustee until Ifeoma turned 25. It seemed straightforward enough. Nomvula would manage the assets, ensure Ifeoma's education and well-being, and when Ifeoma came of age, everything would transfer to her control. The lawyer looked at Ifeoma with something like pity in his eyes before gathering his papers and leaving. The mask dropped the moment the front door closed behind him. Nomvula turned to face Ifeoma with an expression that contained no trace of the grief she'd performed so convincingly all day. Her eyes were cold and calculating, her mouth set in a thin line that held no warmth whatsoever. She walked slowly around the dining room table, her heels clicking against the marble floor with deliberate precision. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of all pretense, revealing something hard and bitter underneath. She told Ifeoma that her father had been weak, that he'd married beneath himself twice, first to Ifeoma's mother, then to Nomvula herself. She said the words casually, as if discussing the weather, but each syllable landed like a physical blow. Iphioma stared at her stepmother in shock, unable to process this sudden transformation from grieving widow to something else entirely. Busisiwe stood behind her mother, no longer pretending to cry, her face reflecting smug satisfaction. Nomvula continued speaking, outlining the new reality with brutal clarity. The house belonged to her now, in every way that mattered. She controlled the money, made the decisions, and Iphioma would follow her rules or find herself with nowhere to go. When Iphioma tried to protest, tried to mention what the lawyer had said about the trust, Nomvula laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Legal documents meant nothing, she said. Iphioma was 17, alone, with no relatives to turn to and no grandfather to protect her anymore. That first night, Nomvula ordered Busisiwe to move into Iphioma's bedroom, the spacious room in the main wing where Iphioma had slept since childhood, where her mother had read her bedtime stories and her father had kissed her goodnight. Busisiwe didn't hesitate, immediately claiming the space as her own with triumphant glee. Iphioma's belongings were pulled from drawers and closets, stuffed carelessly into black garbage bags like trash being prepared for disposal. Her books, her clothes, the stuffed animals she'd kept from childhood, photographs of her parents, everything went into those bags. When Iphioma tried to save a framed picture of her mother, Nomvula snatched it from her hands and dropped it in a bag with such force the glass cracked. She told Iphioma to carry the bags to the garage, all of them, and that's where she'd be sleeping from now on. Charity cases don't get bedrooms, Nomvula said, her voice dripping with disdain. The garage had a small attached bathroom, originally built as a servant's quarters back when the house was first constructed. That would be more than adequate for someone in Iphioma's position. Iphioma stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening, unable to reconcile this cruelty with everything she'd thought she knew about her life. But Nomvula wasn't finished. She established rules, each one designed to strip away another piece of Iphioma's identity and autonomy. Iphioma was forbidden from using the surname Oluwaseun in public. When introduced to visitors, she would be described as a relative's child they were helping, never as Jabari's daughter. She would not eat meals with the family. She would ask permission before using any household resources. She would make herself useful by helping with cleaning and household tasks. And she would be grateful, Nomvula emphasized, because plenty of girls in her situation ended up in far worse circumstances. That night, alone in the converted garage space, Iphioma sat on the bare concrete floor surrounded by garbage bags and tried to process the complete destruction of her world. The garage was cold and dim, lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. Gardening tools lined the walls, bags of fertilizer were stacked in the corner, and oil stains marked the floor where cars had once been parked. The attached bathroom was tiny and utilitarian, with cracked tiles and a rust-stained sink. This was her home now, this concrete box that smelled of gasoline and motor oil. She pulled her mother's necklace from one of the bags and clutched it in her hands, the delicate gold chain and small pendant, the only connection she had left to the woman who'd loved her unconditionally. She thought about her grandfather Lungelo, wishing desperately that he was still alive. He would never have allowed this to happen. He'd been a force of nature, a self-made billionaire who'd built his telecommunications empire through intelligence and sheer determination. When Iphioma's mother died, Lungelo had been her rock, promising her that she was an Oluwaseun, and that name meant something. It meant strength, resilience, legacy. But Lungelo had drowned 3 years ago in South Africa, his body lost to the ocean, and now Iphioma had no one. She tried calling his old phone number, a desperate attempt to reach across death itself, but the line was disconnected. She was truly alone. The weeks became months, and months became years, and Iphioma learned to navigate her new reality with the survival instincts of someone with no other choice. She attended public school while Busisiwe went to an expensive private academy across town. Nomvula forbade Ifeoma from mentioning the family's wealth to anyone, from talking about her father or her previous life. At school, teachers assumed she was a scholarship student from a poor background, and Ifeoma never corrected them. What would be the point? Who would believe that she lived in a mansion but slept in a garage? That her stepmother controlled millions of dollars that rightfully belonged to her? She focused on her studies with fierce determination, earning top grades in every class because school was the only place where she could prove she was somebody, that she mattered. Her history teacher, Mr. Kalapo, noticed her potential and encouraged her to apply for advanced placement courses. He also noticed the bruises on her hands and knees from scrubbing floors, the way she sometimes fell asleep during class from exhaustion, the fact that she never had money for lunch. One day he pulled her aside and asked if everything was all right at home, his eyes full of concern and questions. Ifeoma lied smoothly, saying she was clumsy and worked part-time to help her family. Mr. Kalapo didn't look convinced, but Ifeoma knew better than to tell the truth. Nomvula had warned her repeatedly about the consequences of sharing their business with outsiders. Foster care would be worse than the garage, Nomvula promised. Group homes, abuse, being shuffled from place to place with no stability whatsoever. At least here, Ifeoma had a roof over her head and regular meals, even if she had to eat them standing in the kitchen after the family was done. By the time Ifeoma turned 19, the erasure was nearly complete. At home, she existed in a state of perpetual invisibility, permitted to be seen only when Nomvula needed her to serve guests or complete some task. Nomvula hosted frequent social events, charity galas, business dinners, garden parties where wealthy friends gathered to network and gossip. On these occasions, Ifeoma was forced to wear a plain black dress and serve drinks and appetizers like hired staff. The guests rarely looked at her directly, and when they did, it was with the vague, uncomfortable awareness that something about the situation wasn't quite right. But people don't like to ask difficult questions, especially when the answers might obligate them to act. One evening, Nomvula hosted a particularly important fundraiser for some cause she pretended to care about. The house was full of influential people in designer clothes, their laughter and conversation echoing through rooms that had once belonged to Ifeoma's parents. Ifeoma moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne glasses, her face carefully blank, trying to make herself as invisible as possible. Then a woman named Ayana, an old friend of her father's who hadn't visited in years, suddenly recognized her. Ayana's eyes widened with shock and confusion as she registered Ifeoma's appearance, the servant's dress, the subservient posture. She called out Ifeoma's name with obvious concern, asking if she was truly Jabari's daughter and what had happened. Before Ifeoma could respond, Nomvula materialized beside them with the smooth grace of a predator, her smile never wavering. She explained in a voice dripping with false compassion that yes, this was poor Ifeoma, such a tragic situation. They'd taken her in as charity after Jabari's death, giving her a place to live and work that provided structure and purpose. Ayana looked from Nomvula to Ifeoma and back again, clearly disturbed but uncertain how to challenge the narrative. Ifeoma could see the moment Ayana decided not to press further, could watch her choose comfort over truth. The dinner party continued, and Ifeoma was ordered to stand in the corner of the dining room, ready to refill glasses or clear plates, but not permitted to sit or eat. She stood there for 3 hours while Nomvula's guests enjoyed an elaborate meal prepared by expensive caterers. Busisiwe, home from her private college for the weekend, made a show of complaining loudly about the help staring, saying it made everyone uncomfortable. Nomvula responded with practiced disappointment, telling Ifeoma to wait in the garage until she was needed for cleanup. The dismissal was delivered in a tone that suggested she was being reasonable, even kind, and several guests nodded approvingly. Ifeoma walked out of the dining room with her head down, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes watching her leave. No one said anything. No one questioned whether it was appropriate for a young woman to be sleeping in a garage while living in a mansion. No one asked why Jabari Oluwaseun's daughter was being treated like a servant in her own home. The silence was almost worse than the cruelty because it confirmed what Nomvula kept telling her, that she truly was nobody, that her name and her history meant nothing, that she could be erased without consequence. In the garage, Ifeoma sat on her thin mattress and stared at the concrete walls that had become her prison. She kept newspaper clippings about her grandfather's drowning hidden in a box under her mattress, reading them over and over, looking for something that didn't quite add up. Lunjalo Oluwaseun had been brilliant and careful, a man who'd built an empire through strategic thinking and calculated risks. Would such a man really drown in an accident? But there was no one to ask, no way to investigate, and eventually Ifeoma told herself she was grasping at fantasies because the truth of her situation was too painful to accept. When Ifeoma turned 21, she received acceptance letters from 3 universities, all offering full academic scholarships based on her exceptional grades and entrance exam scores. For the first time in years, she felt something like hope stirring in her chest. University meant escape, meant dormitories and distance and the possibility of building a life beyond Nomvula's control. She was legally an adult now, able to make her own decisions, even if she couldn't access her inheritance for another 4 years. She imagined studying business like her grandfather had, maybe eventually finding a way to reclaim what was rightfully hers. But Nomvula found the acceptance letters before Ifeoma could hide them. She read through each one slowly, her expression shifting from surprise to calculation to cold determination. Then she tore them into pieces methodically, letting the shredded paper fall to the floor like confetti. Nomvula asked Ifeoma if she'd really thought she'd be permitted to leave, if she truly believed that was how this worked. Who would maintain the house if Ifeoma left? Who would serve at Nomvula's dinner parties? And more importantly, who would be around to ensure Ifeoma never started asking questions about her trust fund, about where the money was actually going, about the properties Nomvula had quietly sold and the investments she'd liquidated? Nomvula's mask slipped for a moment, revealing the calculating predator beneath the elegant facade. She forced Ifeoma to write rejection letters to all 3 universities, standing over her shoulder to ensure the words were sufficiently discouraging. Ifeoma's hand shook as she wrote, her dreams crumbling to dust with each pen stroke. When she finished, Nomvula smiled and told her it was time to accept reality. Ifeoma wasn't family, she was staff who happened to live there, and the sooner she made peace with her place, the easier her life would be. That same year, Busisiwi got engaged to the son of a wealthy real estate developer, a union that would expand Nomvula's social and financial influence considerably. Nomvula announced plans for an elaborate engagement party at the house, sparing no expense on decorations and catering. She ordered Ifeoma to serve at the party, wearing what could only be described as a maid's costume, a black dress with a white apron and collar that looked like something from a historical drama. When the package arrived and Ifeoma saw the outfit, something inside her finally cracked. She confronted Nomvula in the kitchen, her voice shaking but determined, saying this was her father's house, her mother's home, that she had rights regardless of what Nomvula claimed. The words came pouring out, years of suppressed anger and grief and injustice bubbling to the surface in a desperate torrent. Nomvula's response was immediate and brutal. She slapped Ifeoma across the face with enough force to leave a red mark, then leaned in close and spoke in a voice that dripped with venom. Ifeoma had nothing, was nothing. Rights belonged to people, and Ifeoma was a ghost who cleaned floors and served drinks. She'd existed in that liminal space for 5 years now, erased so completely that no one even remembered she'd once been somebody. Who would believe her if she tried to claim otherwise? Who would care? The slap itself wasn't what broke Ifeoma. It was the absolute certainty in Nomvula's voice, the unshakable confidence that she'd won so completely that Ifeoma had no moves left to make. That night, Ifeoma sat in the garage clutching her mother's necklace and seriously considered running away. But where would she go? She had no money, no identification beyond a school ID, no support system. 5 years of isolation had cut her off from every friend and connection she'd once had. What Ifeoma didn't know was that while she was living in that garage, slowly being erased from existence, her grandfather Lungelo was very much alive. He hadn't drowned off the coast of South Africa 5 years earlier. He'd suffered a massive stroke during a business meeting in Cape Town. The stroke had been severe enough to put him in a coma for 6 months, his body maintained by machines while his brain fought to repair itself. When he finally woke up, his memory was fractured, whole chunks of his life scattered like puzzle pieces he couldn't quite fit together. He remembered his business, remembered building his empire, but the details of his personal life were frustratingly vague. He knew he'd had a son, knew there was someone important he needed to find, but the specifics eluded him. His business partner, Chike, had stayed by his side through the recovery, helping to reconstruct Lungelo's life from financial records and photographs. It took months of physical therapy before Lungelo could walk again, months more before his speech returned to normal. And it took nearly 2 years before his memories started coming back with clarity. When he finally remembered his son Jabari clearly, remembered his granddaughter Ifeoma, the joy of recall was immediately followed by desperate urgency. He had to find them, had to reconnect with the family he'd been separated from. But Chike had devastating news. Jabari had died in a car accident several years earlier. Lungelo's grief was compounded by guilt and rage at time lost, at not being there when his son needed him. Lungelo's next question was immediate. What about Ifeoma? Where was his granddaughter? Cheek's investigation uncovered that Ifeoma had supposedly moved away after her father's death to live with distant relatives, her whereabouts unknown. But something about that explanation didn't sit right with Lungelo. His granddaughter would have tried to find him, and would have reached out when Jabari died, unless she thought he was dead too. Lungelo started making calls and discovered that someone had spread information about his drowning, had sent documentation to various contacts claiming his body had been lost at sea. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Nomvula, Jabari's second wife, a woman Lungelo had never trusted despite his son's assurances, must have blocked all contact, must have deliberately kept Ifeoma from knowing he was alive. But why? The answer became clear when Lungelo examined Jabari's will and the trust documents. Nomvula controlled everything until Ifeoma turned 25, and based on property records and financial transfers, she'd been systematically draining the estate. She had every reason to keep Ifeoma isolated and uninformed, to prevent her from claiming her inheritance or finding someone who might help her. Lungelo hired a private investigator named Kendi, a sharp woman with decades of experience tracking down missing persons. He gave her one directive: find my granddaughter and find out what's really happening. Kendi's investigation took 3 months, and what she uncovered made Lungelo's blood run cold. Nomvula was still living in Jabari's house, the estate where Lungelo's son had raised his daughter, but there was no public record of Ifeoma anywhere. No college enrollment, no employment history, no social media presence, nothing. For a 22-year-old woman, that level of invisibility was deeply suspicious. Kendi staked out the house for weeks, documenting who came and went. She saw Nomvula hosting lavish parties, saw Busisiwe arriving in expensive cars, saw catering staff and housekeepers and groundskeepers, but no Ifeoma. Then one evening, just as Kendi was about to pack up her camera, she saw movement near the garage. A young woman emerged carrying cleaning supplies, and even from a distance Kendi could see the family resemblance to the photos Lungelo had provided. She was thinner than in the old pictures, her movements cautious and subdued. But it was definitely Ifeoma. Kendi watched as the young woman walked to the main house, knocked on the back door like a servant, and waited for permission to enter. The investigator's instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. She expanded her investigation, interviewing neighbors under various pretexts. An elderly woman named Mrs. Folick proved especially informative. She'd known the family for decades, had watched Ifeoma grow up. Mrs. Folick confirmed with tears in her eyes that Ifeoma lived in the garage, that she was treated like household staff, that the entire neighborhood knew something was wrong, but no one had intervened. When Kendi asked why, Mrs. Folick admitted she was ashamed. Nomvula was powerful and vindictive, and people were afraid of making enemies. Kendi returned to Lungelo with her findings, presenting photographs, witness statements, and financial records that painted a damning picture. Nomvula had been systematically isolating and abusing Ifeoma while embezzling from her trust fund. Properties had been sold, investments liquidated, and money transferred to accounts in Nomvula's name. She'd forged documents, filed false reports, and created a paper trail that made it look like Ifeoma had willingly given up claim to her inheritance. The most damning piece of evidence was a letter Kendi had obtained from university records, Ifeoma's handwritten rejection of a full scholarship, the shaky writing suggesting coercion. Lungelo stared at that letter for a long time, his hands trembling with fury. His granddaughter had been imprisoned in her own home, her identity stripped away, her future stolen while he'd been recovering an ocean away. 5 years of her life destroyed by a woman who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth. Lungelo made a decision in that moment. He was going to South Africa immediately, and he was going to bring Ifeoma home. Not just physically, but in every sense that mattered. He would restore her name, her inheritance, her place in the world, and Nomvula would face consequences for every day of suffering she'd inflicted. The night before Busisiwe's engagement party, the house was in controlled chaos. Caterers moved through the kitchen, preparing elaborate dishes, while Nomvula supervised every detail with the exacting perfectionism of someone who viewed events as performances. Busisiwe fluttered around in an expensive dress, practicing her smile for the photos that would be taken the next evening. And in the garage, Ifeoma sat on her mattress, trying to prepare herself mentally for the humiliation of serving at her stepsister's engagement party while wearing a costume designed to emphasize her servant status. She'd stopped fighting years ago, stopped hoping for rescue or change. Survival required acceptance, and Ifeoma had become very good at surviving. Then came a knock at the front door, loud, authoritative, impossible to ignore. The house manager answered and immediately stepped back in surprise. Outside stood 3 black SUVs with tinted windows, their engines still running. A security detail of 4 men in dark suits flanked the entrance, and at the center of it all stood a man in his 70s wearing an impeccably tailored suit, his presence commanding immediate attention and respect. Lungelo Oluwaseun had arrived, and he wasn't asking permission. Nomvula appeared at the door, summoned by the commotion, and the blood drained from her face when she saw who was standing there. Her carefully maintained composure shattered for just a moment, revealing genuine shock and something very close to fear. Lungelo looked at her with cold eyes that had seen through far more sophisticated liars than Nomvula could ever hope to be. His voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke, telling her that he was surprised to see her looking so well, considering she'd attended his funeral 5 years ago. The sarcasm cut like a blade. Nomvula tried to recover, her acting skills kicking in as she expressed shock and joy at seeing him alive. She babbled something about the reports of his drowning, about how they'd all mourned him, about what a miracle his survival was. But Lungelo cut through her performance with surgical precision, demanding to know where his granddaughter was. Nomvula's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, false confusion. She claimed Ifeoma wasn't there, that after Jabari's death, Ifeoma had wanted independence and moved away to live with cousins in another state. The lie came smoothly, practiced, almost believable. But Lungelo didn't believe it for a second. He'd been a successful businessman for 5 decades because he could read people, could spot deception in the micro-expressions that most people never noticed. Lungelo's voice rose for the first time, demanding the truth. Behind him, his lawyer and investigator Kendi stood ready with folders full of evidence. Neighbors had started gathering on the street, drawn by the unusual sight of luxury vehicles and security personnel. Mrs. Folake stood on her front porch, hand over her mouth, recognizing Lungelo from years past. Lungelo told Nomvula he had financial records proving Ifeoma never left, property documents showing exactly who'd been living in the house, witness statements from neighbors who'd watched his granddaughter being abused for 5 years. The words hit like hammer blows, each one stripping away another layer of Nomvula's facade. She tried to maintain control, to argue, but her daughter Busisiwe cracked under the pressure. Busisiwe blurted out that Ifeoma was in the garage, the words escaping before she could stop them. Nomvula shot her daughter a look of pure fury, but the damage was done. Lungelo's face transformed, rage and heartbreak and disbelief, combining into an expression that made even his own security team step back. He repeated the words slowly, as if testing whether they could possibly be real. His granddaughter living in a garage, in her own family home. He pushed past Nomvula without asking permission, striding through the house he'd visited many times when his son was alive. He knew exactly where the garage was. Lungelo opened the garage door and stopped dead in his tracks. The single bulb provided barely enough light to see, but what he could see broke something fundamental inside him. His granddaughter, Jabari's daughter, the little girl he'd taught to read and promised to protect, was sitting on a bare mattress on the concrete floor. She was surrounded by cleaning supplies, gardening tools stacked around her living space, oil stains on the floor beneath her feet. She wore an old sweatshirt and jeans that had seen better days, and when she looked up at the sound of the door opening, her eyes were wide with confusion and fear. She didn't recognize him at first. 5 years of suffering had aged her beyond her 22 years, and Lungelo had aged too, had changed from the vital 67-year-old grandfather she'd known to a man marked by illness and recovery. His voice cracked when he said her name, all the authority and anger draining away to reveal only grief. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph, himself with a 12-year-old Ifeoma taken at her birthday party 7 years earlier. Her expression changed as recognition dawned, moving from confusion to disbelief to desperate hope. She whispered his name like a question, like a prayer, asking if he was real because they'd told her he drowned, told her he was dead. Lungelo crossed the space between them and knelt on that oil-stained concrete floor, pulling his granddaughter into his arms. 5 years of pain and isolation poured out of Ifeoma in great heaving sobs as she clutched at her grandfather's suit jacket. She told him everything in broken fragments, how Nomvula had erased her, how she'd been forbidden to use her own name, how no one had helped, how she'd been made to feel like nothing for so long she'd almost started believing it. Lungelo held her and wept, this powerful billionaire who'd built an empire, reducing himself to tears over the suffering of the child he'd failed to protect. He promised her that nobody would ever hurt her again, that he was there now and everything would be made right. He told her that he knew her name, Ifeoma Okonkwo, his granddaughter, his blood, his heir, and he promised that the whole world was about to know that name too, would know exactly what had been done to her and who would pay the price. He helped her stand and led her out of that garage, through the house where she'd been erased, past the stepmother who'd tried to destroy her. Nomvula stood frozen in the foyer, her face ashen, finally understanding that her carefully constructed house of lies was collapsing around her. Lungelo called the police from inside the garage, refusing to let Ifeoma out of his sight for even a moment. Officers arrived within 15 minutes, and Kendi began presenting evidence with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd prepared for exactly this moment: financial fraud, identity theft, filing false death reports, guardianship abuse, embezzlement. The charges piled up while Nomvula tried desperately to maintain some shred of control. She attempted to characterize Ifeoma as difficult and ungrateful, claiming she'd provided care for a troubled teenager who'd never appreciated her sacrifices. But the evidence was overwhelming and Nomvula's performance wasn't convincing anymore. Mrs. Folick stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined, and gave a statement about what she'd witnessed over 5 years. Other neighbors followed, each one adding their testimony to the damning portrait of systematic abuse. Even Mr. Adeyemi, the businessman who'd attended Nomvula's dinner parties, came forward to report how Nomvula had lied about Ifeoma's mental state to prevent people from asking questions. The police arrested both Nomvula and Busisiwe, handcuffs clicking shut with satisfying finality. Busisiwe broke down immediately, crying that her mother had promised it would be fine, that no one would ever find out. Nomvula shot her daughter a look of contempt before turning that same look on Ifeoma. Her final words dripped with venom, calling Ifeoma an ungrateful wretch who'd been given a roof and safety. But Lungelo's response cut through that delusion like a knife. A garage floor wasn't a roof, and torture didn't qualify as safety. He told the officers to take them away, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that moved millions of dollars and thousands of people. Lungelo took Ifeoma to a private hospital that same night, refusing to wait even another day before getting her medical attention. Doctors conducted a thorough evaluation and found exactly what Lungelo had feared: chronic malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, untreated injuries from years of physical labor her young body wasn't prepared for, and psychological trauma that would take years to properly address. The doctor told Lungelo privately that Ifeoma's body would heal relatively quickly with proper care, but the psychological damage was more complex. 5 years of systematic dehumanization left scars that medicine couldn't simply erase. Lungelo stayed by Ifeoma's bedside through that first night and many nights after, unwilling to leave her alone after she'd spent so long in isolation. She asked him the question he'd been dreading: why hadn't he come sooner? The guilt in that question, the implication that she'd somehow been abandoned, cut deeper than any business failure ever had. Lungelo explained everything: the stroke, the coma, the memory loss, the years of recovery and reconstruction. He showed her the investigation files, showed her how he'd been searching for her from the moment he remembered she existed. Years of investigator reports, search records, dead ends followed by new leads. He told her she'd never been forgotten, never been erased from his heart, even when she'd been erased from every other record. Ifeoma listened to all of it and finally allowed herself to believe that someone had been looking for her, that she truly hadn't been abandoned to suffer alone. The legal proceedings moved forward with the inexorable weight of overwhelming evidence. Nomvula was charged with multiple felonies, including fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, false reporting, and guardianship abuse. The prosecutor's office built an airtight case using Kendi's investigation, witness testimony, financial forensics, and Ifeoma's own statement. Busisiwe took a plea deal early, agreeing to testify against her mother in exchange for reduced charges. Her testimony proved devastating, revealing the calculated nature of Nomvula's abuse and the extent to which she'd planned to keep Ifeoma suppressed until well past her 25th birthday. The trial lasted 3 weeks and attracted significant media attention. The story of a billionaire's granddaughter imprisoned in her own home proved too compelling for news outlets to ignore. Ifeoma didn't attend most of the proceedings, focusing instead on her recovery, but she gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in stunned silence. She spoke about what it felt like to be systematically erased, to have her name taken away, to be made invisible in her own life. The judge sentenced Nomvula to 15 years in federal prison and, based on the financial evidence, ordered full restitution of all embezzled funds, plus penalties. Every asset Nomvula had acquired through fraud was seized and returned to Ifeoma's control. The house, the investments, the life insurance payout, the trust fund Jabari had established, everything came back. The lawyers calculated that with the original inheritance plus 5 years of investment growth, Ifeoma was now worth approximately $8 million. And that didn't include her position as Lungalo's heir, which would eventually make her one of the wealthiest young women in the country. 3 months after her rescue, Ifeoma enrolled in university with her grandfather's full support. She chose business school, wanting to understand the empire Lungalo had built and the legacy she would someday inherit. She didn't move back into her father's house. The memories there were too painful, too contaminated by years of suffering. Instead, she lived with Lungalo in his family estate, a different property that had been in the Oluwasen family for generations. For the first time in 5 years, she had her own bedroom with soft sheets and warm blankets. She had regular meals at a table where she was welcome to speak and be heard. She had a grandfather who asked about her day and cared about her answers. The healing process was slow and non-linear. Some days she felt strong and hopeful. Other days the trauma would resurface in unexpected ways. But she was healing, which was more than she dared hope for during those years in the garage. One afternoon, Ifeoma returned to her father's house for the first time since the rescue. She walked through rooms where she'd once been erased, stood in spaces where she'd served as an invisible ghost. In the attic, she found boxes that Nomvula had hidden but never destroyed, photographs of Ifeoma's childhood, pictures of her mother, mementos from her early years. Nomvula had hidden them away to maintain the fiction of erasure, but she hadn't quite been able to throw them away. Ifeoma spent hours going through those boxes, reclaiming pieces of her history. She had the photos professionally restored and framed, then hung them throughout the house in a deliberate act of restoration. This was her home, her history, her family's legacy, and no one would erase it again. A year after her rescue, Ifeoma made a decision that surprised even Lungalo. She would host a charity gala at her father's house, not to prove anything to the people who'd failed her, but to reclaim the space on her own terms and to support other young people in guardianship situations. The guest list included many of the same people who'd attended Nomvula's parties, who'd watched Ifioma serve drinks and said nothing. Some declined the invitation out of shame or discomfort, but many attended, perhaps hoping for a chance at redemption or at least absolution. Ifeoma stood in the foyer of her family home, wearing an elegant dress and her mother's necklace, greeting guests with genuine warmth that came from a place of healing rather than performance. She was no longer the invisible girl in the garage. She was Ifeoma Okonkwo, university student, heir to a business empire, survivor, and most importantly, herself. Mr. Adeyemi approached her early in the evening, his discomfort obvious. He told her he owed her an apology, that he should have asked questions years ago instead of accepting comfortable lies. Ifeoma appreciated the honesty and told him that his presence now mattered more than his silence then. She wasn't interested in holding grudges or punishing people for their past failures. She was interested in moving forward and making sure other people in her situation had advocates and protection. Mrs. Folake was given a seat of honor at the gala, the elderly neighbor who'd been one of the few people willing to acknowledge the truth. Ifeoma made sure everyone knew that Mrs. Folake had tried to help when others stayed silent. That courage sometimes looks like an elderly woman offering quiet support when everyone else turns away. When it came time for speeches, Ifeoma stood at a microphone in the same dining room where she'd once been forced to stand in the corner as silent help. Her voice was steady and clear as she talked about erasure and restoration, about what it means to have your identity stripped away and what it takes to reclaim it. She spoke about the house itself, how these walls had witnessed her destruction but now bore witness to her healing. She told the assembled guests that her story wasn't unique, that countless young people in guardianship situations faced abuse and exploitation every year. The charity she was establishing would fund legal advocacy and support services for those young people, ensuring they had someone fighting for them the way Lungelo had fought for her. She ended her speech with words that resonated through the room. To everyone suffering in silence, you are not invisible. You are not forgotten. Your name matters. The applause was thunderous, and more than a few guests wiped away tears. After the guests left and the caterers cleaned up, Ifeoma walked out to the garage with Lungelo beside her. The space had been completely transformed, no longer a prison but a bright art studio filled with paintings and natural light. Ifeoma had taken up painting during her recovery, finding that putting images on canvas helped process trauma that words couldn't quite capture. The walls were covered with her work, portraits of her mother based on old photographs, abstract pieces representing different stages of her healing journey, and one large canvas depicting the garage as it had been, dark and confining, with a door opening to brilliant light beyond. Lungelo stood looking at that painting for a long time, his hand resting on Ifeoma's shoulder. She told him about the symbolism, how the garage represented not just her personal prison, but any confining situation that tries to reduce someone to nothing, and the light represented not rescue exactly, but the possibility that always exists, even in the darkest circumstances, the possibility that someone might knock on the door, that truth might surface, that justice might eventually arrive. They stood there together in comfortable silence, grandfather and granddaughter, two survivors who'd found each other across impossible circumstances. The final image was one of restoration in its purest form. Ifeoma and Lungelo walked through the garden together as evening light turned everything golden. The same garden where Ifeoma had once worked as unpaid labor was now maintained by properly paid staff, and she walked through it as its rightful owner. They talked about business school, about Ifeoma's plans for the future, about the telecommunications company she would someday help run. Lungelo shared stories about building his empire from nothing, about the failures and lessons that had shaped his success, about the legacy he wanted to leave behind. But more than business advice, he gave her something more precious: absolute certainty that she was valued, that her name carried weight and meaning, that she belonged to a family and a history that no one could erase. Ifeoma listened and absorbed every word, storing them away like treasures. She thought about the girl she'd been 5 years ago, standing at her father's funeral with no idea how dramatically her life was about to change. She thought about the years in the garage, the systematic erasure, the crushing weight of invisibility, and she thought about who she was now, scarred but healing, damaged but not destroyed, still learning who Ifeoma Okonkwo truly was beneath the layers of trauma. The journey wasn't finished. Healing would take years, maybe a lifetime, but she was on the path, walking beside someone who would never let her be forgotten again. They tried to erase her name, tried to reduce her to nothing, tried to make her believe she had no value beyond what she could provide to others. But they'd forgotten something crucial about names and identity and legacy. Some things can't be erased no matter how hard someone tries. A name written in legal documents and financial records can be buried, but a name written in someone's heart, carried in someone's memory, protected by someone's love, that kind of name is indestructible. Ifeoma Okonkwo had always been somebody, had always mattered, had always carried her parents' love and her grandfather's legacy. She just needed someone to remember, someone to fight through lies and barriers and distance to bring her back into the light. Nomvula had spent 5 years trying to make Ifeoma disappear, but all she'd accomplished was her own destruction. Because at the end of the story, the girl in the garage walked free while the woman who imprisoned her sat in a cell. Justice had taken its time arriving, had moved with frustrating slowness, but it had arrived. And Ifeoma stood in her family's garden with her grandfather's arm around her shoulders, her mother's necklace at her throat, her father's strength in her spine, and her own name, her real name, the one that mattered, restored to her at last. Nomvula spent 5 years trying to erase Ifeoma's identity, but she couldn't erase her worth. This story proves that truth always surfaces, and justice, though delayed, is never denied. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories of survival and triumph. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done if you were Ifeoma's neighbor. Would you have stayed silent or would you have spoken up? Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they matter, that their name matters, no matter who tries to erase it. Next video drops in 3 days. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, you are never invisible. You are never forgotten.